Turn to your hymns for worship. Turn to number 37. Number 37, Revive Us Again. After the singing of this song, we'll be dismissed to class. O soul, we pray. Good evening. I don't speak that. No. All right. We are in Daniel. And I don't remember where we're at now. Seems like it's been forever since I've been here, since I was out last Wednesday and then we were out Sunday. It just seems odd not to be worshiping with y'all. All right. We're still in Daniel chapter 1. I believe we got down to, we talked about verses 8, 9, and 10 a little bit. So we're going to read verses, let's read verses 9 through 16, and then we'll talk a little bit about that. Verse 9, it says, Now God had brought Daniel into the favor and goodwill of the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I fear my lord, the king, who has appointed your food and drink. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you would endanger my head before the king. So Daniel said to the steward, whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, Please test your servant for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. Then let our appearance be examined before you, and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter, and tested them 10 days. And at the end of 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. Thus the steward took away their portion of delicacies and the wine that they were to drink, and gave them vegetables. So the last time, 2 weeks ago, we talked a little bit about this. Daniel had decided that for whatever reason, and we discussed, if you'll remember, we discussed 3 different reasons of why Daniel possibly did not want to eat of the king's delicacies, drink the wine. But he'd already decided that he wasn't going to do that. He wasn't going to defile what he felt was defiling himself to partake of this. So he goes before the chief of the eunuchs. Now, in verse 9 it says, God had brought Daniel, to me meaning that it was because of God that Daniel found favor with the chief of the eunuchs. And he asked, what does he ask him? Yes. What did Daniel?
Daniel wanted to not eat from the king's delicacies.
He didn't want to be forced to.
But he may have not known what he might have been eating. Could have defiled.
Exactly. I think it's important to note verse 9. Had Daniel not had good favor or kindness, as what I've got a little side note on goodwill. Is there another word instead of goodwill or kindness? Another version. Alan, what's in verse 9? Favor. Does it say favor and compassion? Okay. Had Daniel not had this favor, goodwill, compassion, kindness from the chief of the eunuchs, what could have happened had Daniel approached and made this request? We see in verse 10 what his answer is, but I think so. I think he could have been punished up to death. So I think it was brave of Daniel to approach him. Verse 10, the chief of the eunuchs tells him, says, basically, in a roundabout way, he says no. And why was that? He was fearful. It's one of those things. I don't know that he was so much worried about Daniel and his friends. He was worried about his own head. So what does Daniel do next in verse 11? Which I think is it's odd. Hang on, I just looked down at my notes. I skipped over something that I want to talk about. Who else, back in Genesis, somebody else found favor with their superior? Joseph. I thought that was, when I was reading through this, that popped into my head as remembering Joseph found favor multiple times because of what God gave him in his abilities. But anyway, in verse 10 or verse 11, Daniel went to a next step. Did he go up in rank? He went down, and I think that's I don't know. It's odd. What do we do at our jobs if we go to our boss and we don't get the answer we want? What do we do sometimes, depending on what it is? And I'm thinking about not just going to him and to our boss and saying, I don't like so-and-so. Can you get rid of him? Well, if that don't work, I go to the next person. I think about it from a safety standpoint. I've always, for years, where I used to work and even where I work now, I think if I went to my immediate supervisor and said, this is happening on our job site. This is a safety violation. It's important. People could get hurt. They could get killed. And nothing happens. Where do we go? Do we go down to the next person below him to think, well, that's going to get us something done? We go to the next in line. So I think it's interesting that Daniel, instead of going to the next person, which I guess would have been King Nebuchadnezzar, which would have not worked out well for him, I'm sure, he went down to the steward. And he does he ask him the same thing? Not exactly. Alan's shaking his head no. He is, but he's not. You know me, I love these trick answers. He's basically saying, I don't want to eat the meat, I don't want to drink the wine. I don't know that he gives them his reasoning behind, I think it could defile me because I don't know that it's not been sacrificed, but this is what I want. But instead of just saying, I don't want to, he says, test us. He goes about it a different way. And, you know, he has success this time. Verse 12 says, he asked him, he said, please test your servant for 10 days and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink. And then let our appearance be examined before you and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies. And as you see fit, so deal with your servants. Okay. So Daniel changes his approach. And he says, test us for 10 days. You give us what we want to eat. And then examine us. Because this steward, he has to report to the chief of the eunuchs. And the chief of the eunuchs, we already know, is concerned about how Daniel and his friends are going to look if they quit eating meat and drinking. So in verse 14 it says he consented. He agreed. Okay. 10 days. What's magic about 10 days here? Anything that...
Well, it's maybe long enough to show some impact, but not so long that they would be such bad shape that they couldn't be. If it didn't go the way Daniel said it would, they weren't going to be walking around barely able to move and just withering away. They'd be able to turn that around fairly quickly. One of the things that I read is it was a long enough period to show something, but not so long that it was going to cause problems for the steward or the chief of the eunuchs, either one. Joe,
yes.
Part of this shows Daniel's wisdom, which he had already been described as wiser than those around him. This proposal was just really a wise proposal. He used judgment in how he approached it.
Right.
Proposed it.
Yeah.
Test, like you said.
Right. No, I mean it does, because he could have just went back and tried the same approach as he did with the chief of the eunuchs, but he realized that he ran into a wall and the door was right there, so he tried a different approach. So yes, again, it shows at a young age the wisdom that he had and the faithfulness that he had. Okay, now this next question. It says, in verse 12, it says, test him for 10 days. Now, the 10 days we realize it's not so long that he's going to be so bad off that he'll get into trouble. But is there anything magical about 10 days from a biblical standpoint? Say magical. Is there any importance to the 10 days? Anything, 7. Yes. Anything that I'm going to go here in just a second. But I'm open for. I wasn't
sure where he's going. That was the only thing I could.
Most people don't know where I'm going, Bo. Don't feel bad.
Did you know this is another way your trip?
I'm trying not to. I'm trying to not be tricky. Do you have?
It's one of the power numbers. It's all okay.
Okay. That was one of the things. It's a complete number. Let's see. Again, in verse 20, there's a few verses that I want to look at that have the number 10 referenced. Verse 20, in all the matters and wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them, meaning Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers. Again, a complete number is that, but again, it's 10 times. Genesis chapter 24. In verse 55. But her brother and her mother said, let the young woman stay with us for a few days, at least 10. After that she may go. chapter 31 and verse 7. Yet your father has deceived me and changed my wages 10 times, but God did not allow him to hurt me. There's the 10 Commandments. The Passover was the 10th day of the first month. We'll see that in Exodus chapter 12. Just some common things. May not mean anything, but just coincidence. But there's others, the 10 plagues of the Egyptians, 10 virgins in Matthew 25. So I think there's some significance, maybe just not major significance. But I think it was interesting that 10 times is used here and in multiple other places. And after the 10 days, we read that says in verse 15, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate of the portion of the king's delicacies. Fatter, when we think of fatter, what do we think? Just fat. No, I don't have any other way of saying that, but fat. A lot of the commentary that I read, that's not necessarily what that meant. They looked healthier, not necessarily fat. Their complexion looked better than the others. Just all around, he achieved what his goal was in this 10 days of eating these vegetables and drinking water. Is that he looked healthy, he looked okay, and the king would never know any wiser. So, there's two things that I take away from this section, verses 8 through 16. One, of course, and we've talked about this, and we'll talk about Daniel and his faithfulness throughout our study. But that's the first thing. Is Daniel and his friends were extremely faithful to serving God under any circumstance. And then the second thing is God's faithfulness to those who obey Him. Now, He dealt with those in the Old Testament different than He does now. Is that right? If He dealt with us today the same way that He dealt with those in the Old Testament, we would probably have a whole lot few people in this world. Because we sin. And we do things that are against God's Word. And I think it's back to Uzzah. Wasn't it Uzzah? Touched the ark. Okay. If we were to do something that God has commanded us not to do, forsaking the assembly, not coming to church, just leaving the Lord, He could, if He dealt with us the same, He could strike us down. But that goes to prove what I'm roundabout way to get to. If we're faithful to God, He is faithful in His promise to us. What is His promise to us? Eternal life. A home with Him in heaven. But He's not just going to give that out just because He's nice. I mean, we have to be... Yes, sir.
So I was going to say, the two things that were is we got hope and inheritance.
Yes.
With God. So Daniel, if we do what's right, we will have hope and inheritance.
That's right. But we have to be faithful. We have to obey His word. We have to, even when things get thick, we have to stay there. And we'll run into those trials in life that will shake us to our core. And I read something the other day that, it disturbed me. And I don't know what this lady's background is as far as her faith. By what she said,
She believes there is a God. I have no doubt about that. But she was going through something in her life. And she said, and I read this off a website, so you know, it's off the internet, everything's true. She said, God's not supposed to try us more than we can handle. Well, he did. He went past that with this, what the problem was, and I won't go into what it was. But she said, this is more than I can handle. God has given me more than I can handle. And that disturbed me to read that. If we're faithful to God, and we are honestly searching and trying to do His will, He's who we'll turn to in those trying times. We'll read about this again in Daniel. That's who Daniel turned to. Daniel turns to God. So, I kind of rambled on about that. I'm sorry. But in the end, our faithfulness to God and God's faithfulness to us is something I took out of those sections. Any questions or comments? Bo.
Just to what you were saying at the end, though, the only problem with that is, I mean, if my mother gets hit by a bus tomorrow, there are people in this world that say that was the hand of God trying that, and we don't know. We attribute everything good or bad to God, and then we get ourselves in a dilemma.
Right.
Down the road instead of just,
Yeah.
looking at it and quit trying to say we know everything that's happening.
Right.
With him, and then we box ourselves in this corner where it somehow puts our faith in it.
Yeah, we try to justify everything, that saying that God did this and God did God force that to happen? I agree. We paint ourselves in a corner sometimes with that. Anything else before we move on to the last section of chapter 1? Okay, 17 through 21. Let's read that. Sammy, would you read that for me?
As for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar. Then the king interviewed them, and among them all, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king. And in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. Thus Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus.
All right, thank you, Sammy. Okay. So again, another in verse 17 we read where these 4 young men, it says God gave them. It says God gave them knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, and Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. Was that just a special thing God gave to them just to prove a point? Or can we attribute it back to what we just talked about? There was, I don't know how many other men was in this group. Did he give them these same gifts? I don't think he did. I think these 4 men are the only ones that he gave that to. Because of their faithfulness, he gives them this ability. Now, aside from him giving Daniel understanding in all visions and dreams, was this other stuff given to them in a miraculous way? The knowledge and skill in all literature and wisdom, was that a miraculous gift to them? Okay. I was hoping you'd say no. I don't think, I guess let me make this statement and we can talk more about it. I don't think it was, they didn't know anything and God said, here you go. Now you know it all.
They were quick to understand and had a lot of knowledge according to verse 4 anyway.
Right.
But I think they were given specialist things, understanding and things in this particular situation.
I think God gave them the ability to learn more so from studying and and work, not necessarily. Again, my thoughts. I think, just a second, Tommy. Now, the understanding in all visions and dreams that he gave to Daniel, I don't think there's enough study and there's no book study. I can't go and sit down with Alan and Alan show me, okay, this is how you interpret dreams and visions and that kind of thing. I think that was a miraculous gift. But I think he gave them the ability to learn as much as they have. Tommy?
Well, aren't we saying a while ago that God maybe had a hand in them keeping their physical appearances and everything as they went through this, what they, did toward the feeding and everything?
Yes.
So if he showed them favor then, could he show them favor to kind of place in the king's court or whatever?
Yeah, I'm not saying he.
Questions and everything like that?
Yeah, I'm not saying he didn't have that. He wasn't instrumental in that, but I don't know.
I think that when the king was questioning them or whatever, and they were coming across with the right answers, even more so than probably the educated men of his court.
Right.
God, I think, was helping them so they could gain favor in his sight.
Yeah. Well, I agree with that. Maybe I'm disproving my own self here.
Are you arguing more providence than direct
Yeah.
intervention, I guess?
Yeah. It's kind of tough for me to differentiate whether it's, Mike, you now know it all. You know everything that the king needs you to know so that my work, meaning God, my work is complete through you, and not just saying, I give them the ability to learn, but they have to actually study and read the books or the scrolls and listen to what their teachers are telling them, that kind of thing. So, okay. Verse 18. Now at the end of the days, the king had said that they would be brought in. The end of the days, there's no question to that it's the end of the 3-year period that we read about earlier in chapter 1. Verse 19 says, Then the king interviewed them, and the things that I read said that King Nebuchadnezzar actually was the one that went through and talked with all these people, asked them questions, and determined on his own. He didn't, I would think as the king, I would send my henchmen out to do that kind of work. But from what I read, the king himself interviewed him. He wanted to know for himself who he had and what type of person they were. And they said that he was a smart man. It wasn't, not that kings are dumb, but he was smarter than normal. That makes sense. But can you imagine the pressure that these men had? I can think about interviews that I've gone on, you can too, and you're sitting there with your potential future bosses and scared to death. This is above and beyond that. Your future boss or potential boss, all he can say is, "No thanks, you're not who I'm looking for." These men, what do you think could have happened to them had they not answered right? I mean, they would have been kicked out of the king's court, but very possibly beaten or even killed. So, a lot of pressure for them. But again, God's hand with Daniel and his friends. The end of verse 19 says that the king found none like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And says, therefore they served before the king. Verse 20 says, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined, we talked about this a minute ago, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. I think this is interesting to me as we go into chapter 2 and further on into Daniel. The king finds these men 10 times better than all the magicians and the astrologers. But we'll read later on, he seems to forget about that. Verse 21, Daniel continued until the first year of King Cyrus. The only really comment I have to that is that the commentaries that I read, basically that just means Daniel was there throughout the whole captivity, and actually even a little bit longer after they are allowed to return. So that's, I think, one of the reasons that was put there. Any questions or comments about chapter 1 before we move on? Okay, chapter 2, verses 1 through 13. Somebody read the first 6 verses for me, Mike.
Now in the second year of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, Nebuchadnezzar had dreams, and his spirit was so troubled that his sleep left him. Then the king gave command to call the magicians, the astrologers, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to tell the king his dreams. So they came and stood before the king. And the king said to them, I have had a dream, and my spirit is anxious to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans spoke to the king in Aram. O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will give the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me and its interpretation, you shall be cut in pieces, and your houses shall be made an ash heap. However, if you tell the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts, rewards, and great honor. Therefore, tell me the dream and its interpretation.
Verse 7 says, they answered again and said, let the king tell his servants the dream, and we will give its interpretation. The king answered and said, I know for certain that you would gain time, because you see that my decision is firm. If you do not make known the dream to me, there is only one decree for you. For you have agreed to speak lying and corrupt words before me till the time has changed. Therefore, tell me the dream, and I shall know that you can give me its interpretation. The Chaldeans answered the king and said, there is not a man on earth who can tell the king's matter. Therefore, no king, lord, or ruler has ever asked such thing of any magician, astrologer, or Chaldean. It is a difficult thing that the king requests, and there is no other who can tell it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. For this reason the king was angry and was furious, and gave the command to destroy all the wise men of Babylon. So the decree went out, and they began killing the wise men, and they sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Okay, so just remember what was said in verse 20 about Daniel and his friends. What did it say? Daniel and his friends were 10 times better than all the magicians and astrologers who were in his realm. Where in the first 13 verses of chapter 2 does the king remember that? He doesn't. I think it's interesting. The king was so impressed with Daniel and his friends, yet he has this dream, and he doesn't think about him. First 13 verses, they're straightforward. The king had a dream. He wanted its interpretation. But there was a twist. And that twist was, I want you to tell me my dream too. Now, can you imagine that these, what I call the king's wise men, saying, sure, I can tell you the interpretation, just tell me what I'm supposed to be interpreting. But can you imagine when the king says, no, I need you to tell me what my dream is too. They just threw him for a loop. There's two thoughts on why King Nebuchadnezzar wants his dream and the interpretation, and not just the interpretation. The first one is that he doesn't remember the dream, but he remembered that it was important. The second one is he wanted to test his magicians and astrologers and so forth to see if they really could do what he thought they could do. Nebuchadnezzar in verse 1, it says that he was so troubled his sleep left him. And we've all had those types of dreams that we wake up confused about something that we dreamed, or I've woke up many times of just pure fear because of the dream that I had. And as the day goes on, you tend to forget what the dream was, but you can't sleep for hours after you wake up. This apparently was worse than that. And Nebuchadnezzar just couldn't, it troubled him. Something terrible. Verse 5, Alan, what does you got the New American Standard?
Yes.
What does verse 5 say? It says the king answered and said to the Chaldeans. What does it say after that?
The command for me is firm. Do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation. You will be torn limb from limb, and your houses will be made rubbish heap.
Okay. Anybody have the old King James? Jason, what's verse 5 say? Okay. It says the dream has gone away from me. Gone from me. That's one of the reasons that they think that he forgot the dream. I'm not going to put it past him that he's just saying that because he doesn't want to let on like he knows what the dream is. So that's his answer to it. Right. Yeah. Exactly. Right. But I just think that was, him saying, and, I've got the New King James, and it says, my decision is firm. They ask him, say, tell me your dream, we'll give you an interpretation. And the king says, my answer is firm. You tell me the interpretation or the dream and the interpretation, then I'll know you're for real. But either way you look at it, whether he forgot or he couldn't remember, or whether he was remembering it and he just didn't want to tell him, it's still a very unique request of a king. Verse 11. I've got a side note that says, instead of it is a difficult thing, it says it's a rare thing. So, it's something that these men are not accustomed to hearing about. This is the only place that we read about that I can think of, anyway.
I think God's problem in all this, chapter 1 and chapter 2, here he is, Nebuchadnezzar has a dream, and now he's going to get rid of all of the chief magicians, and he's going to have Daniel.
Yeah.
He's going to be the only one to interpret his dream.
Right. Okay. Thank you. We'll continue on with chapter 2 next week and see how far we get.